Welcome to Episode 1 of Grandy's Adventure Storybook. Stories for grandchildren of any age, written and performed by me, Andrew Cullum. Telling the adventures of Edward, a boy secret agent for the King in the English Civil War. Part 1. When did you last see your father? Edward loved to go out riding horses, but today was extra special. This time his father was with him, and Edward had been allowed to travel the first few miles of the journey with him. When they'd left home, Edward heard his mother say to his father, "Richard, you must make sure he can get back here. He's only young." Why do grown-ups always think children aren't listening when they talk about them? Edward wasn't only young. He was 8 years old, and everyone said what a grown-up boy he was. It was a bright, clear morning with dew on wet grass sparkling in the sunshine. Sir Richard turned to Edward as they rode along and said, "Listen, Edward, I've got something to tell you. We live in strange times. Do you know what civil war is?" "No, not really," said Edward. Of course, he knew what war is. It was civil that he didn't understand. "A war is usually fought between two or more different countries," said Sir Richard. "Yes, and there are good people and bad people," said Edward. "A civil war is when there are some people in a country on one side and other people in the same country on the other side. Sometimes it can be hard to tell who is on which side. Now, as you know, I am one of the commanders of the Royal Army. I'm also a friend of the King. There are some people who don't like the King and are gathering their armies to fight us. Now, I'm going to get my army ready to fight. So I need you to be very brave." Edward was puzzled. Last summer, when he'd fallen off his horse and sprained his ankle, it had hurt a lot. "You must be brave, my little wounded soldier," his granny had said as she put a bandage on his foot. Edward had tried really hard not to cry, but the tears had still come. "Do you mean I mustn't cry if I hurt myself?" he asked. Sir Richard smiled. "Sometimes, but there's more to it. You might need to do things that you think you can't do, and pretend not to be afraid when really you are. Being brave is hard, very hard, especially when you're scared. I'll try and get back home as soon as I can, and now—" Sir Richard stopped his horse at the top of the hill they had reached. "It's time for you to head back home." "I'd rather come with you, Dad." Edward loved his father and loved spending time with his father's friends. They were mostly soldiers in fine clothes, who told him how much like his father he was. They told stories of adventures they'd had and brave men they'd met. Two names were mentioned a lot. One was a mysterious soldier called Rafe de Courcy, who sometimes wore disguise and worked for the King in secret, and the other was Sir Richard, Edward's father, who they all said was the best commander they'd ever worked for. "I'd love you to come with me, my son. But I need you to go and look after your mother and Susan, and that, my boy, is an order." Edward laughed. He knew his father was serious, but also joking at the same time. "Yes, sir," he said, because he'd heard his father's soldier friends call him Sir when he gave them an order. Edward enjoyed the ride back. The morning dew had now gone, but he could feel his cheeks going red in the chill air. He thought about his father's soldier friends, the jolly one with a booming laugh and fancy clothes, who everyone called the laughing cavalier, Lieutenant John Thistledown, who was a much younger man with kind eyes, and Rafe de Courcy, the secret agent whom he hadn't met, but had heard all about his adventures in other countries and many narrow escapes. As he made the horse trot faster, He imagined that he was Rafe de Courcy, and pretended to shoot enemy soldiers he imagined hiding behind the hedges. As soon as he arrived back home, Edward knew something was wrong. There were horses and soldiers milling around outside the house. A well-built man with copper-coloured hair was in the stable-yard, standing next to a soldier wearing a round metal helmet and carrying a spear. "Get off the horse, young man," said the copper-haired man without smiling, and he grabbed the horse's bridle. Edward got off the horse. "Come back here," said the man. "You dropped this." And he gave Edward a small wallet. Edward was confused. This wasn't his. So why had the man said it was? As soon as Edward was off the horse, the soldier in the metal helmet grabbed him by the arm and dragged him towards the house. The copper-haired man led the horse away towards the stables. "This way, you posh little pipsqueak. Stop struggling or I'll hurt you," said the soldier, leading Edward across the courtyard towards the house. Edward wanted to cry. This was frightening. But he decided to be brave, like his father had told him. The soldier pushed him into the house. There were soldiers everywhere, waiting in the hallway, sitting on the stairs. Why were they here? Edward heard voices from the dining room. "I have told you, Lady Catherine, I have a warrant to arrest your husband." Edward understood that word. Arrest. It was what happened when criminals and bad people were caught and taken to prison. "My husband is a good man," Edward heard his mother say in a quiet voice. And then there was laughter from some of the other men in the room, nasty laughter. The sort of laughter people do when they want to make fun of someone they don't like. Edward was pushed into the room. Why did these men want to arrest his father? Standing near the doorway were his mother, his granny, and his sister Susan, who had been crying. A soldier had his hand on her shoulder. Sitting behind the dining table was a man in a grey jacket with white cuffs. He had some papers in front of him. There was an older man in a black hat who looked like a priest. There was another man in a black hat who was holding Edward's father's treasure box. Another man, sitting at the end of the table, had a quill pen and was writing on a piece of parchment. "Ah, here he is at last," said the man in the grey jacket. "And where have you been on this fine spring morning?" The soldier pushed Edward forwards, so he was facing the man across the table. "Well," said the man, "where have you been?" The man smiled, but Edward noticed that the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He was watching Edward closely. "I've been out riding, sir." The man with the quill pen started writing scratch, scratch, scratch across the paper. "Riding, you say?" "Yes, sir." Scratch, scratch, scratch went the pen. "You hear that, young man? Mr. Claiborne here is writing down everything you say. So when we read it back, if we find you haven't told us the truth, well—" The man gave another smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There will be trouble." Susan gave a loud sob from behind him. Edward turned towards her. She was 2 years older than he was, and she was always sensible and kind. Edward didn't like seeing her cry. "Young man, don't turn away from me," snapped the man behind the table. "I'm in charge now, and I'm talking to you." Edward suddenly felt angry. This strange man was sitting in his father's house and behaving as if he owned the place. On the floor, under the table, there was a footstool, the sort of thing you rest your feet on when you're sitting in a chair. Edward pulled it out and stood on it to give himself a few more inches of height. He looked at the man and said something he'd heard his father say once. "I think, sir, you are mistaken." There was silence in the room for several seconds. The man with the quill pen stopped writing. The 2 men in black hats looked surprised. The man behind the table gave Edward an icy look. "If I were you, young man, I'd be very careful how you speak to me." Just then, the man with the copper-coloured hair who had taken Edward's horse back to the stable came in and sat behind the table. "The young lad's been out riding, Mr. Sinclair. Galloping, I think. The horse was quite sweaty." "Oh, very good, young Edward. Keep telling me the truth, and we'll get along just fine. How far did you ride today?" "About 5 miles. Where did you go?" "Across the fields." "What was the purpose of the journey?" "I like riding." "You like riding? And what did your father talk to you about as you rode along together?" Edward realized that this was a trick question. He must not tell this Mr. Sinclair where his father had gone. "Well?" The man was watching him closely. "I was on my own, sir." "I think the lad's telling the truth, sir," said the man with the copper hair. "The stable for Sir Richard's horse hasn't been used for days." Edward was surprised. Anyone who knew about horses would know that the horse had been in the stable overnight. The man with the copper-coloured hair had told a lie to help him. Edward looked at him. The man looked at Edward, and very slyly winked. Sinclair asked Edward, "When did you last see your father?" Edward looked at the copper-haired man, who gave the smallest shake of his head, so small that no one else in the room noticed it. "Oh, not for many days, sir." Edward glanced at the copper-haired man, who gave a tiny nod of his head. "I see," said Sinclair. "When you last saw your father, did he head north or south?" The copper-haired man interrupted. "Mr. Sinclair, with respect, we're wasting time with this lad. And we wasted time coming here. He's just a boy who's been out riding his horse. If we're to catch Sir Richard and arrest him, we need to head for the south." "I suppose you're right," said Sinclair. "We'll stay here the night and leave first thing in the morning. You may go. Guards, release the women." Edward's mother and Susan ran over to him and gave him a big hug. For the rest of the day, the soldiers were getting ready to sleep on the floor in the dining room, and Edward, Susan, Lady Catherine, and Granny kept out of their way in their bedroom. "You were so brave," said Susan. "Yes, you were," said his mother. "Oh, you're just like your father, not afraid of anything." Except Edward knew he had been scared, but he'd tried very hard not to show it. Much later, when everyone had gone to bed, Edward opened the wallet the copper-haired man had given him. Inside was a small piece of paper. "Dear Edward, meet me at the stables at midnight tonight. I am a friend." Edward looked at the clock. It was 10 minutes to midnight. How would he get down to the stables with so many soldiers in the house? As quietly as he could, he opened his bedroom door and crept along the hallway. The sound of the soldiers' rumbling snores came from the dining room. When he reached the top of the stairs and looked down, he heard voices. There were some soldiers sitting on the stairs, talking quietly. That man Sinclair must have told them to guard the staircase so that Edward, Lady Catherine, Susan, and Granny couldn't escape. Edward thought about what his father might say. "Well," he would say, "we'll soon see about that." Edward crept back along the hallway to the door of the upstairs library. He opened it and slipped inside. He lit a candle to see where he was going and went to the bookcase by the fireplace. Now, which book was it? He tried a very large dictionary at the end of a row. No, that book was very heavy. How about the small book of children's stories No. And then he saw it. The book his father had told him never to touch and never to tell anyone was there. This was only for emergencies. The book was a story called The Secret is Here. And it wasn't really a book at all, even though it looked like a book. It was a cleverly disguised handle to open a door to a secret passage. Edward carefully tilted the book towards him. It felt like a book, but as it tilted just a few degrees towards him, he felt and heard a soft click. And the bottom two shelves full of books swung inwards, revealing the entrance to the secret tunnel which would lead out of the house. He crawled inside, and by the light of a candle he could see stone steps leading downwards. He closed the secret bookcase door behind him and crept down the cold stone staircase. The candle threw dancing shadows onto the ceiling and walls of the staircase. The steps came to an end, and now the tunnel was running more or less in a straight line. He'd better hurry. Feeling the breeze coming from the tunnel's opening, Edward began to walk more quickly, and then he tripped, dropped the candle with a clatter. Out it went, and all was darkness. His ankle hurt, the one he had sprained last summer. Trying to ignore the pain, he crept forwards in the tunnel, the breeze still in his face. Then he saw the moon and the stars in the night sky. The opening to the tunnel was hidden behind a bush, and Edward crept carefully out onto the path around the house, his feet crunching lightly on the gravel, not far to the stables. Just along the side of the house, across the drive and into the courtyard, Edward walked as quietly as he could. His ankle was hurting, and he didn't want to make any noise. He reached the end of the house and was about to cross the drive when he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel right ahead of him. It was so dark that if it hadn't been for the sound of footsteps, Edward would have walked right into the soldier on night guard duty who was walking slowly around the house. Hardly daring to breathe, Edward hid in the shadow of the house wall as the guard walked past him no further from him than if they'd been playing a game of Ludo. Edward waited until the guard was out of earshot, and then walked as quickly as his hurting ankle would allow into the stable yard. Would the copper-haired man really be there? He walked over to the stable where his horse, Shimmer, had her stable. He walked inside. Then there came a man's whisper. "Edward." It was the copper-haired man. "Yes, sir." The man gave Edward a letter. "Listen carefully, Edward. I'm really working for the king. I've only been pretending to be on Sinclair's side. I want you to go now and take this letter to your father. It tells him about Sinclair's plans for the next few months." The man opened the stable door and led Shimmer, Edward's horse, out into the courtyard, the horse's breath steaming in the cold night air. Edward suddenly felt foolish. "But, sir, I don't know where my father is." "Of course you do," smiled the man. "He took you there this morning when you went for a ride with him." "He told me he would do that. He didn't tell you in case you were caught and the enemy tried to make you talk. 2 miles further from where you went this morning, he's with his friends in the inn next to the watermill. Sinclair and his men are moving on in the morning. I'll make sure no one notices you've gone missing, and I won't let them hurt your mother and sister. Now go, quickly." "But who are you, sir?" "Like I say, a friend. You've already met the laughing cavalier and Lieutenant Thistledown. I don't know whether they've mentioned me. My name is Rafe de Courcy. And I can tell you now, young Edward, you are a very brave young man. I must get back inside." If Sinclair finds out I work with your father, he'll have me shot. Godspeed, young sir." Rafe patted Shimmer and slipped back into the shadows of the house, and Edward trotted the horse out across the courtyard into the fields where he and his father had ridden only that morning. Edward smiled to himself as he rode Shimmer under a full moon in a black velvet sky flickering with stars, and realized that his adventures as a secret agent for the king had only just begun. That was When Did You Last See Your Father?, which is part 1 of The Adventures of Edward. Next time, in part 2, Edward goes on his first mission accompanied by a new friend who everyone knows as the Laughing Cavalier. If you're enjoying Grandy's Adventure Storybook, please leave me a rating and a review, but most of all, tell your friends, because you can take it from me, everybody loves a good story. In the meantime, until we meet again, goodbye for now.